Welcome back to another dispatch from Hollie MEK. Today we are going to Albania because Hollie was there and met with survivors of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's brutality in Iran. Tell us a little bit more about that, Hollie.
So I thought this was a really timely story because obviously talks with the Iran deal being back sort of very much on the table. And so I just think it was a really important time to kind of go back through history and look at some of what the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has really stood for in the past few decades, and bring to bear the really big question, which is, do we want to be sort of in some sort of cahoots or relationship with this particular regime, which has ruled Iran for since the 1979, since the Shah was ousted. And there is a very controversial group, and it is known as the MEK. And it's sort of absolutely number one on the Tehran hate/terrorist list. The lengths that the regime has sort of gone to in recent years have been absolutely horrific, to sort of try to brutalize this particular organization, which it frames as sort of a cult. And this organization is now based in, as I said, the MEK, and they're very open about their real goal is to see the regime overthrown, and to try to sort of restore Iran to some sort of sense of what it used to be prior to the fall of 1979. So it's very controversial from that point of view. But the reason they are in Albania, and they have a camp called Ashraf 3, and I just thought this was a really interesting opportunity for me to go and look at this compound, which is where a lot of the MEK kind of activists live, and they sort of have a big base there, and then a lot of them also live in Paris as well, which is sort of their other big kind of core base. But it's a really interesting place, and a unique opportunity. As I said, it's Ashraf 3 because prior to being in Albania, they actually had camps. Once not being able to kind of go to Iran, they had camps in Iraq, and there was Ashraf 1 and Ashraf 2. And what happened was they, after the war, and when the US came, US protected them in these places. And then the moment that the US signed its agreement to withdraw troops in 2011 and sort of hand the keys over to Maliki, it was sort of the Iraqis then were the ones that were in charge of protecting them. But of course, Iraq's relationship with Iran, subjected them to a huge amount of absolute horrible, bombing. You're talking about children being killed, you're talking about children being kidnapped, and it's just horrific. And this had happened at one location, then again at another, and that's when it was sort of very clear that Iraq no longer sort of had the control in its own country of what Iran was doing, or what Iran was sort of putting them up to do. So it's an incredible twisted sort of event. But what I was really interested in was going back to a lot of the people, and I interviewed many men and many women who told very horrific stories of being in these regime prisons in the 1980s, when the current regime sort of took over, the Ayatollahs. And I just, in my years of doing this, I never heard such horrific torture stories really in all my life. And they were sort of tortured again for protesting the Ayatollahs and the regime. And it was just beyond horrific. One example from a woman named Cobra was, she was 7 months pregnant when they came to her house to arrest her, and she had guards stomping on her stomach. You had just people that had been forced into these rooms where they would just hang dozens of men and women at once, and and being forced to watch that happen, and see people that or share a cell with, or your friends hanging from a rope, and just the stories were just absolutely horrific. And I remember sort of going at that particular time that I was there, and then I went back to Ukraine to work, and just absolutely having these horrific nightmares, because it really was hard to imagine how anyone could have survived that. And thousands, the MEK says 30,000, some groups sort of say the number was lower than that, but in any case, horrific. The amount of sort of MEK supporters that were killed during that period in jails, that were sentenced to death, and they call it sort of a massacre, which is certainly, just listening to the gunshots, and it's really absolutely chilling. And I just think it's important that throughout time we forget about history. We tend to forget these stories. New wars happen, but I do believe that it's horrific, and that sometimes it is really important to go back and to revisit some of these challenging stories, to sort of get a better idea of what we're dealing with. And of course, Raisi, the current president of Iran, played a big role in these massacres as well. And he was sort of one of the judges. At that point, he was sort of just a young man in his 20s, but had been elevated to a very powerful position. Was very much in charge of sentencing a lot of these people to death, and authorizing their torture. And I just think it's important for us and at the negotiating table to remember these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like these people had an easy, well, they've had a terrible time of it. I mean, so they, even setting up their diaspora in Iraq, and then at some point in time with the Iranian friendly militias that show up in Iraq, so they're not welcome there again. So they've been repeatedly displaced, repeatedly chased and persecuted by a regime that is really still controlled by the same people, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, that have this long-term history of being very, very brutal to anybody that they don't like. And it's not like they're not active, and it's not like they're not a threat to regional stability in the Middle East even today.
Absolutely. And for whatever reason, I think the MEK, you'll certainly, if you Google them, you'll see an abundance of very negative articles about them. And I certainly think they have been maligned a lot in the mainstream media over the years. And at one point, certainly were a designated terrorist organization in the US. However, when you dig a little bit deeper into that authorization came under President Clinton. And I think there was a lot of back talks at the time where Iran had sort of agreed, well, if you designate them terrorists, then we'll agree to designate Hezbollah terrorists, which of course the US really wanted that in the 90s. But of course, Iran allegedly didn't live up to their end of the bargain. And so that the MEK had to fight for many years to eventually be taken off that in 2012. But even prior to that, in Iraq, they were considered to be protected persons by the United States. So it's a very sort of interesting history there. But regardless, I think anytime there is a situation which is such mass human rights abuses are committed, when women are raped on scale just to in a level that I cannot even begin to imagine, I will highlight those issues, however controversial and however many people sort of come back to attack me for that. I think anytime this happens, it should be acknowledged.
Yeah. Well, yes, and I know that you've taken your share of criticism showing both sides of this story over the years, because there's a great deal of polarity when it comes to these kinds of opinions. This is not the only group that the world tries to forget and tries to sweep underneath the carpet, and but you don't let them go. So here we are, remembering the fact that the IRGC are not nice people, and it's important that be brought up every once in a while. So thank you, Hollie, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Dennis.